chemical equations and reactions. In this chapter, chemical equations and reactions, in the introduction part, what is that we are going to study in this chapter? What are the important areas we are going to study in this chapter? The important concepts are in this chapter we are going to study, that is, first one, meaning of a chemical equation, meaning of a chemical equation, then types of chemical equations, then the chemical changes, physical states of species in chemical equation. Additionally, energy changes in chemical reaction. Then oxidation reduction process in chemical reaction. Oxidation and reduction reaction in chemical, oxidation reduction process in a chemical reaction. Then finally, last but not the least, that is electrolysis. Of different electrolytes in the form of salts, salt solutions, or simply water molecules. This is the introduction part in the chemical equations and reactions. So, to study all these topics one after the other, let us first begin our discussion with the meaning of chemical equation. A chemical equation is also called as a chemical equation can also be called as a chemical reaction. The meaning of chemical equation, meaning or definition of chemical equation. Definition of chemical equation, that is the symbolic representation of atoms or molecules or formula units, atoms or molecules or formula units in a chemical reaction. in a chemical reaction, the symbolic representation of atoms or molecules or formula units in a chemical reaction is simply called as the chemical equation. Simply called as chemical equation. Now suppose, how do you illustrate this chemical, how do you illustrate the definition of this chemical equation? If you take a chemical equation is basically made up of one LHS side and one RHS side. This LHS side of the chemical equation and the RHS side of the chemical equation is separated through an arrow. On the LHS side of this chemical equation, on the LHS side we have reactants, and on the RHS side we have products. Reactants, when you take reactants on the LHS side separated by arrow, in the RHS side we have products. These reactants and products in a chemical equation is again made up of the species, like reactants are made up of atoms or molecules. Again in the products also we can repeat the same thing, that is atoms or molecules. Usually if you take a chemical equation, you can see that the reactants and products are separated through an arrow. The tail of the arrow is facing the reactants, and the head of the arrow, this is the head of the arrow facing the products, this is the tail of the arrow facing the reactants. So here in this chemical equation, when you go for chemical equation, what is the important information you can gather from the chemical equation? When you go for chemical equation can be represented in many ways. We can represent the chemical equation in simple terms, like take one example. I'm giving you one simple example. You take calcium oxide, which is a solid, also called quicklime. You dissolve this calcium oxide in water, which is liquid. The chemical change takes place. The reactant, here the quicklime, calcium oxide is the reactant. It is being dissolved in water. Molecule. Of course, calcium oxide, quicklime and the water molecule, both of them, they are reactants, but it is actually the quicklime which is being dissolved in water. The necessary chemical change takes place and the product is formed. That product we call it as calcium hydroxide aqueous, CaOH taken twice, that is calcium hydroxide. This calcium hydroxide is also called slacked lime. So here quicklime is acting as a reactant. The quicklime is being dissolved in water, and the chemical change takes place and the formation of products occurs. And the product formed in this chemical reaction is calcium hydroxide aqueous, CaOH taken twice is calcium hydroxide, and it is also called as slacked lime. So in this way, this is one simple example, this is one simple chemical reaction where we can understand how a chemical equation is taking place how a chemical equation is studied between the reactants and products. By taking this simple example, okay, we can understand how the molecules are involved in a given chemical change, such that ultimately the reactants and products together makes up a chemical equation. Some more examples we are going to study about the chemical equation.